Good evening and welcome to Quorum. I'm Ron Brown. Thanks for joining us as we begin our 35th season of legislative affairs coverage here on MPB. Now, just 2 nights ago, Governor Haley Barbour delivered his State of the State address, confirming what most of us had feared for months, that the state of Mississippi faces a budget crisis of grave proportions. And it's one that stretches from the current fiscal year right through the next couple of years. This is a complex issue and one that requires a wide range of insights and expertise to understand in full. Well, tonight on Quorum and throughout the season, we have opened our panel to a wide range of political, economic, and community analysts and newsmakers. With us this evening are Dr. Marty Wiseman. He is the director of Stennis Institute of Government at Mississippi State University. Emily Wagster Pettis, a veteran reporter from the Associated Press and a longtime observer of legislative affairs. You've read her work. Dr. Mary Coleman, director of the Center for University Scholars at Jackson State University. And Blake Wilson, president of the Mississippi Economic Council. To all of you, thanks for your help this evening. Of course, we need your input as well. For 35 years, your phone calls have been a key part of the program. The toll-free number is on your screen right now. From anywhere in Mississippi, call us at 1-877-405-5247. That's 1-877-405-5247. And you may begin calling us with your questions for our guests right now. For those of you on the internet, you can email your questions to quorum@mpbonline.org. You can also join the chat on Facebook and Twitter, something else new this year. To get the ball rolling tonight, we're going to recap the State of the State address delivered Monday night to a joint session of the Mississippi legislature. The governor's speech clearly began on a positive note. He said he offered praise to House and Senate lawmakers for their quick work in passing an incentives package for the German pipe maker Schultz. The company will build a new plant in Tunica County, creating some 500 jobs. He also welcomed the reauthorization of the Workforce Enhancement Training Fund, again on the first day of the legislative session. Governor Barbour put a heavy emphasis on job training at the top of his address, and he listed a series of developments in the state's energy sector. He calls it a growing and critical part of Mississippi's future, especially in terms of jobs creation.
I spent the first part of my speech tonight talking about job creation, because Mississippi families know job creation is the most important thing needed to help them, their businesses, and our state. More people working means more income for those families who are personally hit by this global recession. It means more revenue for our small and middle-class businesses who are the backbone of our economy and of the nation's economy too. And here in state government, job creation means more taxpayers with more taxable income. Indeed, most of the difficult budget problems facing us this session, and for another year or two after that, I'm afraid to tell you, directly result from job losses and the recession that led to them. We all know we must have a balanced budget. And it appears to me that there's no appetite for tax increases. I agree. I don't have any appetite for tax increases. In a recession, when our businesses and families are hard pressed and their incomes are down, the last thing we should do is further reduce their incomes by raising taxes. I've asked you to change that law to allow the governor the flexibility to cut departments and agencies by up to 10%. The Senate has passed such a bill, though it limits the governor's discretion to just this year, ending at sine die, which is fine with me. I will suggest that you're probably going to want to give the governor this flexibility again next year for the same reasons, but there's no reason to have to deal with that now. Because departments and agencies, especially education, need to know as soon as possible what size cuts they have to make. I ask and urge the House to please pass this 10% flexibility bill. If not, every department and agency will be cut about 8.1%, including special as well as general funds. Let me close on this subject by saying current law would not produce an acceptable answer in implementing the required budget cuts to have a balanced budget. But the only choices are current law, the Senate bill, or for the legislature to make the cuts. If the legislature wants to enact the needed $200+ million in cuts, that's fine with me. But my experience is that would take a long time, when time is what our schools, departments, and agencies don't have.
Now, that was a main point that the governor made in the State of the State address, one of only a few. This afternoon, in a letter to Senate and House Appropriations Chairman, agency leaders, some of the largest state agencies in the state, say that lifting restrictions imposed by state service statutes would allow them to more effectively achieve the savings necessary. So they are backing the governor on that. But on Tuesday afternoon, the Democratic-led House of Representatives offered the governor its version of the Senate's budget authorization bill, and that's a measure that the governor quickly rejected. Let's turn to Emily Wagster-Pettis, who reported on the measure. Emily, what did House Bill 392 offer, and why exactly do you think the governor rejected it?
The big thing it does is it would require the governor to dip into the state's financial reserves, to take $50 million out of the $231 million in the so-called rainy day fund. It would also require him to use $61 million of federal stimulus money that has been set aside for his discretionary use, and to essentially take the $50 million and the $61 million and put that into some of the state agencies so that their cuts would not be as severe. Now, under the House plan, he would be looking at roughly an additional $10 million of cuts on top of the $226 that he's done already. Without the House plan, if you just look at the governor's projections, he would have to make about another $211 million of cuts. So there's a significant difference. Now, the reason he rejected this is because he says the financial reserves have to last, because this global recession is sort of indefinite right now. No one really knows when Mississippi will pull out of it and when the broader economy will pull out of it. And so he's trying to be cautious and have some money in the next couple of years.
In a statement that he released today, he said that pretty much that they want to use too much too soon, and he wants the rainy day fund to last a little bit longer than just 1 year. But there are others who will argue that the rainy day fund is there for a rainy day and it's raining in Mississippi. Does anybody else agree with that?
Well, it's clearly raining in Mississippi, Ron, and it's raining all over the country, and every state, virtually every state, is dealing with exactly this issue, some in far worse condition than we are. And I think what we have to keep in mind is that this is the time we are in today. But my son plays ice hockey on the Mississippi State ice hockey team, and so I've started following ice hockey. And Wayne Gretzky says you can't win at ice hockey if you chase the puck. You've got to position yourself to field the puck. And so really, this is the game we're in today, but what we're having to look at is what's the game we're going to be in tomorrow, and I think that's what really the legislature and the governor are both trying to deal with.
Dr. Marty Weissman, you didn't care too much for the governor's State of the State address?
Oh, I thought he did. It was a very strategic address, in that he could have done, when you talk about programs in a year when all you can do is cut them, then you literally risk littering the landscape with hand grenades that are going to do damage to someone in the legislature. He avoided that and only had one major ask, and that is give me 10% rather than 5%, but more importantly, give me the flexibility to cut specific agencies more than others, and then gave some examples of some of that. But after that, he let it alone.
Yeah, so by doing that, doesn't he emphasize that this is the most important thing to me? This is what I'm going to go to the mat for and on, and then right away.
But the question is why? The governor's speech lacked justification. First of all, he didn't say to us, these are the priorities. These are the issues for which we should fight. These are the agencies for which there can be little negotiation with respect to budget cuts. So there was no willingness on his part to say, these are the priorities and these are the reasons why we need to have this debate. This is why the House needs to agree with me. So as governor, especially as a governor with national political ambition, I expected Haley to say, this is what's important to this state. This is why it's important. And this is why I need this flexibility or more authority or more power. He wasn't willing to do that. He didn't want to bring any more animus to this fight than has already occurred. And that was disappointing.
Well, in essence, he did the one thing. He offered up 3,400 to 4,000
The prisoners.
prisoners being released on society, and used fairly strong words to say that, and that's because prisoners don't have a constituency. I mean, nobody is going to warm up to prisoners, so you can, that would be the price paid if he didn't have the flexibility, is releasing 4,000 convicts, as he called them.
But that kind of talk is fear talk. It's fear mongering. It's not governance.
So you were looking for more concrete
I was looking
reasons.
for governance. I was looking for him to say we have to make tough choices. But he appealed to our emotions, not to our ability to reason. And it just seems to me he missed that opportunity because, frankly, he has the Senate in his pocketbook. He can do whatever he wants to do with the Senate. It's the House where he has to make justification, where he needs to offer up some alternatives. What about consolidation? What about school mergers? Why are these good ideas? How will that improve quality education? He wasn't able to say that. I don't think he has a clue, other than we need budget cuts.
Well, we spoke with House Majority Leader Tyrone Ellis. He delivered the Democratic response to the governor's State of the State address. And among those highlights there, Representative Ellis agreed with Governor Barbour that job growth is the state's top priority. He rejected the governor's proposal to close many of the state's mental health crisis centers. And Ellis confirmed that even such critical state services as education would need to lose funding. But he said that such cuts will be temporary, and he promised that the state of Mississippi will take care of state employees and their families, saying that the Democratic House is committed to paying retirement in full. On Tuesday, we asked Majority Leader Ellis directly for his reaction to the State of the State address. Here's what he told us.
There were some disappointments in some of his statements. We anticipated him making remarks regarding the challenges that we face and the requests to try and work together and to try and help meet some common ground about balancing of the budget. Even though he spoke about the consideration of jobs being a top priority, I cannot begin to understand how you can have jobs as a top priority when you are continually making cuts in education. Without an educable, trainable workforce, you cannot increase the jobs in our state. And I think that was one of the disappointing parts of his speech that I would have concern with, because even though he spoke about jobs, you cannot have one without the other. If the electric company is about to, or gas company is about to cut off your lights or your gas, and you have $10,000 in the bank, and they say, we're going to come and cut your lights off unless you pay us, would you pay the light bill or the gas bill, or would you just let the money, the $10,000, sit in the savings account? And I say that because we have 340 plus in the bank. And to sit back and say we must close the crisis centers, we must release 3,000 to 4,000 inmates, we must do all of these things, we must talk about doomsday here in Mississippi, when yet we have $340 plus million in the bank. Notwithstanding, the President of the United States gave to the governor $61 million discretionary money to spend in whatever way he deemed necessary to help stimulate Mississippi's economy and to help Mississippi in the depressed state that it is in. It is in a depressed state right now. It is time to utilize part of that $61 million, if not all of that $61 million. And there's another $50 million that he has at his disposal, giving a total of $111 million that he has, notwithstanding that he turned away $56 million he turned down from the stimulus package under Unemployment Modernization Act. So when you say, when you cry doomsday, when you say we have to release all of these inmates and you have to close all of these crisis centers, and you're sitting on all of these millions and millions of dollars in the bank, I don't understand the rationale in that. We are prepared to compromise, we are prepared to negotiate, but in the art of compromise, there's some give and take. It's not something that you deal with. Compromise is not an all or nothing as it is being presented to us. You either do it this way or no other way.
And we will hear more from the House Majority Leader and the Governor's address as this hour-long edition of Quorum continues. But he's talking about compromise. The Governor was saying that he was willing to compromise in the State of the State address. Everybody's saying it. Can it be done? Emily?
It will have to be done at some point. The question is the timing, and this is not an original thought to me. Wish I could take credit, but I've heard people at the Capitol say that the longer this goes on, the more it is to the advantage of the House Democrats, because this actually makes a lot of sense. Governor Barber says if you're going to direct state agencies to make substantial cuts in their programs, it's easier for them to absorb the cuts now rather than closer to June 30th. Mm-hmm. So because of that, the longer this drags on, the more likely it is that at some point he'll have to give in and say, okay, we're going to take more than I really wanted to take from the rainy day fund.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree with this, Dr. Wiseman?
Well, and I think the compromise right now has got to be more in a sense of perspective than real nuts and bolts, and that the governor is looking at things from a macro level. He sees the aggregate of how bad the picture is and how big the cuts have to be. The legislature comes from the districts. They look at things from a grassroots level. They've got to explain policy to folks standing around the coffee pot at the Baptist church in the rural area of the state and tell them why their schools are about to be consolidated from 3 or 4 schools into Prentice Central or something. And that has historically been a terribly tough thing to be able to do, and as it was pointed out in one article today, caused a legislator to be beat who was looking. So that's only one of the issues, but mental, in the halls after the speech, education in schools and mental health were the biggest concern I heard from legislators as a trade-off for the prisoner example.
Mm-hmm. Well, House Majority Leader Tyrone Ellis told us a little bit more on his thoughts about the consolidation of the schools and mental health, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But compromise, is it just a nice word that they use at the beginning of the legislature, and is it something that you believe can be accomplished as we move on?
It's going to be accomplished. This is the 3rd state I've worked in my profession, and if you go back and look at where the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia, you realize that that process took a long time, and finally the heat of the summer kind of drove everybody to finally come to an agreement. I mean, this is how our governing process works. It's not a real pretty process, but that's what happens. And eventually they will, as Emily pointed out. They're going to come to an agreement, and they're going to find a way to pass a budget, and they're all going to go home and move on.
Well, is this business as usual?
Well, I hope they do it before the heat of the summer forces
Right, exactly. I do too.
There's no guarantee on that. The governor keeps saying that these are dire times. These are tough times. Things have changed. It cannot be business as usual, but politically that sounds like business as usual. A lot of saber rattling, and then you get down to the wire.
Sure. And
you make the compromise that you have to make.
Well, we're a country of differing peoples and differing points of views, and that's really what makes our country strong. And this process is what's been set up to make it work. And fortunately, historically, it works. Mm-hmm. But it isn't a pretty process.
We want to remind our viewers and our listeners that you can call in, ask questions of the panel. Our phone number is on the screen, but for those of you listening on the internet or on the radio, the number is 1-877-405-5247. 877-405-5247. 888-848-9747. And we're speaking with Emily Waxter-Pettis, who's a reporter for the Associated Press, Dr. Marty Weissman, director of the Stennis Institute of Government at Mississippi State University, Blake Wilson, the president of the Mississippi Economic Council, and Dr. Mary Coleman, the director of the Center for University Scholars at Jackson State. Let's listen to Governor Barber's remarks again on Monday at the State Address when he was talking about workforce training in the state, another major point of his.
Some think workforce training is something we do for employers to attract industries and jobs, and that's true, but that's only a small part of it. I believe workforce development and skills training are things we owe our working people to help them increase their wages and get better benefits. Sometimes more skills leads to new, higher paying jobs, but most of the time, this training is necessary to keep the current job or to get a promotion at the current workplace, and it works.
Spending more for workforce training, it sounds good, and one of his points was that's what needs, if we create more jobs, that's what's going to get us out of this economic recession, and that's what's needed nationally as well. One of his nods to a national audience, which may have been just for the national audience. What kind of jobs are available out there?
Well, there is a growing tendency in Mississippi, thanks to the leadership of this governor and thanks to the support of this legislature, for going after really new manufacturing. This General Electric plant expansion that's been announced in Batesville, Schultz in Tunica, ATK in Iuka, the Severstal plant, one of the most modern steel plants in the world now in Columbus, Eurocopter, and we can go down the list. This is all new industry that has come into Mississippi, and I think what's important to keep in mind is that we are in a very strong position for coming out of this recession stronger than some of our competing states because we have some things in the ground. We have this Toyota plant that's in North Mississippi that is ready to come online. We have the PACCAR facility in Columbus. Those are positive things. That means that when the economy starts moving and there's pent-up demand, the average age of a car on the road today is 6 years. The average age of a truck on the road today is 7 years. That creates a pent-up demand that when this economy starts to roll again, there's going to be a need for these kind of, so that's the kind of job that's going to be available. So the governor's right. Workforce training is critical. That's the short-term answer. Long-term answer continues also to be education at all levels. We have got to invest in education in Mississippi, and that's been a key priority of MEC historically for many, many years for the reason that that's what's going to put Mississippi in the place of greatest opportunity.
We have a call from Holmes County. This is James. James, you have a question for our panel?
All right, thank you, Ron. I would like to propose to the panel, one member of the panel mentioned education. Now, I would like to know what would it profit the state of Mississippi to close in the Delta, Mississippi Valley, Murray Valley State, and Alcorn University of Jackson State, when we die need economic improvement. We have great highway system here in the Delta, the Mississippi River. We have a great potential here in the Mississippi Delta. But if you close the economic boom, which is Mississippi Valley State to the Lafleur County, Humphrey County, Holmes County, and Talley County, we will eventually suffer as we are already suffering in that era. So it doesn't make sense to me to merge those universities when we need education in the Delta, especially in the Mississippi Delta. And I would like to hear the panel. What profit, what money will we save if we merge those universities?
Okay. Dr. Mary Coleman, do you agree with James? Do you think that it makes sense to consolidate the universities to save money, fiscally responsible?
I don't know if it makes sense or not, but it would be useful to have somebody justify that as a recommendation.
Before you make a decision.
Before you make that recommendation, what counts as evidence that it makes any sense? And he's certainly right that the Mississippi Delta needs all of the human capital development that the state can muster. And the merger, it seems to me, was just thrown out there as an idea. It wasn't thrown out with any seriousness of purpose. Otherwise, there would have been a justification for it. So I agree with the caller that we need, A, to think about justification for it, B, the impact on the local economies of those places, not just the universities themselves. And then what cost reductions would there be? and the quality of the education that will result as a part of the merger. Really important question.
Dr. Wiseman, just as an idea, without any of the specifics that Dr. Coleman is asking for right now, just as an idea to consolidate the schools, there are going to be some areas that are going to be hurt by that. If it helps anybody, there are still going to be some areas that are going to be hurt, so it's a trade-off. From what you know about it, do you agree with the proposal?
As far as public school consolidation is concerned, consolidating to reduce 52 school districts is a major, and I'm thinking about counties in the past, like when the Yellow Creek project was being developed up around Iuka and consolidating the Tishomingo County schools, and there were, even with the money made available to do that, there was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Schools are very, very personal to a lot of people, and when you see a school that ceases to exist in a rural community, it's not long before the rural community declines considerably. And those emotions can't be discounted when you put them in the legislative mix, because that pressure is coming to bear on legislators. You know, and there'd have to be a whole lot more as to how much the savings would be. And I'm concerned in general, though, whether it's K-12 or universities or community colleges, about huge cuts in education, because Mississippi was behind to begin with. And we are in danger of cutting all of our gains that we made as we were heading for the state that was in 49th place. And I'm hoping that the compromise that's worked out will be one that saves a lot of the cuts in education so that they don't have to be made.
I thought it was interesting to note that there was not a single word about this in the State of the State.
Exactly.
And so he threw this out there back in November and created a lot of discussion.
Do you think he's backing off of it now?
I don't know if he's backing off of it or not, but I think that the governor's staff and a lot of legislators have recognized the political difficulty of handling this. I mean, it's just something that people get very emotional about. They're loyal to their universities and to their K-12 schools. And it's very difficult to deal with. And I think where they may end up dealing with this issue on some level is looking at things that are strictly administrative, like purchasing or hiring or things like that. And so if you can consolidate services where you're buying supplies in bulk for all of your universities instead of for each university individually, there are some legislators who think they can realize some significant savings doing that. And I mean, frankly, that doesn't affect the football team. It doesn't affect the name of anybody's school. That takes a lot of the emotion out of it.
Okay, now earlier we spoke with Tyrone Ellis about this same issue, and here's what he had to say. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. It's here right now.
I believe the governor understands that he cannot do that without coming through the legislature. And there's already there's not enough votes to do it. I believe, my belief is that it was a diversion to distract us and to concentrate on something else that he wants to do. He wants us to be diverted thinking about the consolidation issue, but the bottom line is he's after something else.
Such as?
Mental health crisis centers, education.
It's an interesting thought. Does anybody agree that that could be a motive, that it may be a diversion tactic? I hadn't thought of that before. I hadn't heard of that before. Dr. Coleman?
I don't know that it was diversionary, but I do know that it wasn't a serious recommendation, because had it been a serious recommendation, there would have been justification for it. But with respect to consolidation, I think Emily and Marty are both right in terms of looking at poor performing schools in our state. We have to ask ourselves, why have we applied for the Race to the Top funds, for example, Obama's national educational program? Has there been any application from Mississippi to help poor performing schools so that they become charter schools, so that kids in those schools who are from poor communities can expect to get a better education, can be taught by teachers who believe in their capacity to learn? That's the kind of discussion I think we need to have, during periods of budgetary shortfalls.
And I think the governor did say when he made his announcement that if anybody has a better idea, he was open for it. But there hasn't been that discussion. I haven't heard any other ideas.
But in the governor's defense on that, he has set up a commission that is that has some resources to really go in and dig into this. And I think what he was trying to do is say, look, we've got to be bold. We've got to think boldly. And he threw out some examples, but said, give us some feedback. And he set up now a process to go in and get us the answers. I mean, I don't know the answers. I wouldn't know, is it enough savings to justify? We don't know. We don't have that data. But there is a commission now that has been impaneled and will be undertaking this project. And I think that is a plus. You know, in a down economy, it gives you an opportunity to basically, you know, cinch back your belt a little bit and find a way to do it better. And so maybe as a result of all this, we will come up with a better, faster, smarter, cheaper government and more effective in education as well. But, you know, whether you consolidate, you know, down to 152 districts down to 100, whether you close university, who knows at this point? And I don't think we have the answer. But what we've got to do is sit there and say, let's look critically at it and not just knee-jerk react. And I think that's what our responsibility is as leaders in the community, is to look at all facets of this, and also not to knee-jerk the other way and say, oh, well, let's make a snap decision. We've got to work through this process.
So the absence of any mention of it in the State Address doesn't necessarily mean the idea is off the table. It just means that it hasn't been formulated yet.
Well, I think he said last week in a press release or something that he had already made a good bit of his State of the State in the budget recommendation. So I think he figured he'd already put that out there. You know, so and that this process has to run a little bit, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not in the governor's shoes. So. Okay.
Let's go to an email question. We are taking email questions at quorum@mpbonline.org. This comes from James Hendrick from Flowood. He says, at the MEC Legislative Scrambler this morning, we heard a bit about altering the state sales tax. Can your panelists provide an understanding of the situation and possibly a prediction of the changes that might be made for altering the state sales tax?
Well, I can help. I think he may have misunderstood a little bit. I think what Chairman Watson was trying to relate to there is that we are so dependent on sales tax in Mississippi that maybe we need to look at broadening our tax base. He was not talking about raising taxes. He was talking about maybe we need to make a change in what we rely on for tax revenue. I think that was his point. And that has been an issue. As you know, the governor had a commission on which Mr. Watson and I both served, where we looked at the whole tax structure in Mississippi. So this is, you know, something that I think he was trying to point out, that because we're dependent heavily in Mississippi on sales tax, when the economy goes down, what happens? Sales tax revenues goes down, therefore our overall tax. So, and where that ends up, we don't know. But I think that was the message he was trying to send at that meeting this morning. So.
Had anybody else heard anything about altering the tax structure?
I'm glad the word tax was brought up, because when you talk about balancing the budget, you usually talk about balancing expenditures with revenues, and we have assumed that there will be no consideration of any different or new revenues. And I don't know at the end of the day if we can get by with just assuming that we don't have to raise some revenues of some sort, whether it's fees or changing the tax structure. We've still got, I know you were on the committee that studied it, a lot of the exemptions that are out there, some that could bear another examination without raising taxes or anything. But when you give an exemption, you remove that money from the possibility of finding its way into the revenue stream. So I think there's several things that we don't need to slam the door on yet.
And what are we giving up? What are we giving up, if anything, to attract these businesses with respect to revenue?
Well, the whole idea of using tax incentives to bring industry into the state is that if you do that, you're going to get that benefit back by increasing the overall tax base, by increasing the employment, by making more people employed. And, you know, it's one of these, it's been often criticized as a zero-sum game, because if we don't do it, the other state will. If they stop doing it, well, we'll keep doing it. And the states fight about this all the time. This is a tough issue. But because we're in a competitive situation, I will tell you, it's very difficult to look at raising taxes. And I don't think you're suggesting that, Dr. Wiseman, but in raising taxes at this time, people are struggling and businesses are struggling. And raising a tax at this time would be very, very hard on I think, anybody in Mississippi. But the opportunity is, let's see how we can cut effectively and then look at our tax structure. So I think it's a double-edged sword.
We have a question, an email question. Actually, it's more of a statement than a question. Starts out rhetorically. Is the Delta a part of Mississippi? If so, we need employment besides convenience stores, mom and pop stores, and hospitals. And Tommy Taylor, obviously from the Delta, keep our manufacturing plants in Mississippi. We need help. And we do have a question on the line. James from Prentiss County, you have a question for our panel here on Quorum?
Yes, I was listening to the governor about wanting to consolidate our schools. Here in Prentiss County, we've got about 6 high schools and 7 elementary schools. We got 3 superintendents of education, and the people can't seem to get our superintendents and to even consider consolidating our schools. And my county school taxes is more than my county property taxes. And when you own several pieces of property, it makes a big difference. What do you think? That is the governor right? Like I think that we need to consolidate our schools better and use our money wiser for poor counties like up here in northeast Mississippi.
That's James. Thank you, James. Thank you for the call. James from Prentiss County, who thinks at least it's something that we need to explore. And I think the panel, we've discussed this already, that we need to explore it, but it hasn't been fleshed out just quite yet.
Actually, the commission that Blake mentioned that the governor put together is going to make a very serious effort to examine this and look at it from financial point of view and look at crunching a lot of numbers. Earlier this week, they voted to hire a consulting firm out of Denver, and this is the same firm that helped write the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, the funding formula, back in the 1990s. It's a very well-respected firm that does a lot of work with public education around the country, and so they're at least making a serious effort to examine geographically which parts of the state might be open for consolidation. Look at the finances of the school districts that are right next to each other and see where, there really might be some savings available.
So just because the governor left it out of his State of the State address, it doesn't mean that it's gone anywhere.
Other states, and I'm thinking of primarily Kentucky, maybe, have gone through this consolidation process, and it was not without a great deal of bitterness, some that still exists, but school consolidation, K-12 consolidation is something that has happened, particularly in some rural areas around the country, so we wouldn't be setting the precedent if
So we have a model to look at
right.
and say, here were the highs and lows and the good and the bad about that.
And we can look at our own history. Jack Reed Sr., one of our sage leaders, he kind of said, well, now, Blake, were you here in 1955? And I said, now, Jack, I was about 2 years old in 1955. And he said, well, we took 1,500 school districts and I had to take them down to 152. And I said, well, okay, I did not know that, but thank you. That's a good piece of information to have. So we've been through consolidation in Mississippi.
I think the point the caller makes is a good one. He is essentially saying we can't let the administrators define the pace of change because they're self-interested. So it raises for me the question of performance measures throughout all agencies in our state. And do we have performance indicators? Do they really mean anything? Do they help the legislature in terms of looking at priorities and cost and savings and places where performance is low? These are the sorts of questions, if everything is on the table, these are the sorts of questions that we have to answer.
Now, one of the most controversial elements in the governor's State of the State speech, at least among his Democratic opponents, was his warning about the budget shortfall and its impact on our jails and prisons. Let's take a listen to the governor.
As an example of why the 10% bill with flexibility is critically needed, let me refer you to the corrections budget for our prison system. An 8.1% cut for corrections would equal $26 million. To make such a cut for the rest of this fiscal year would require the Corrections Department to let 3,400 to 4,000 prisoners out of prison in short order. This would be 3,400 or 4,000 convicts who are not approved for parole, have not gone through any pre-release preparation or training, and for whom there are very, very few jobs in Mississippi today.
And Dr. Marty Weissman, were you alarmed by that in the speech, or you just?
Well, I thought it was an effective example. You're never going to get any support for coddling or otherwise turning loose prisoners or anything. And so his basic point was, if I've got to hold them to the same 8.1% that I do everybody else, it's going to mean prisoners are going to be turned loose. I know that some people considered it a scare tactic.
Do you think it's a realistic problem? Do you think that it's?
Well, I think it has a kind of a rebound effect, because immediately you had some legislators saying, well, I still don't feel like we should be sacrificing education dollars mainly just to keep prisoners locked up. So you know, it'll be a point of debate as we go along, but you know, that's one of the trade-offs, and he threw it out there as a legitimate example. If you can't do this, you got to do that.
You think it's legitimate, and you thought it was effective, but you also thought it was
with the average voter in Mississippi, it will be effective.
Mm. Does everybody agree on that point? That
I don't know who the average voter in Mississippi is, but I consider myself very average, and it wasn't effective for me. It was a scare tactic. Mm-hmm. It wasn't anything that a person aspiring to be a national statesman would have said with any seriousness.
Well, a good example is the fact that it's been brought up year after year to try to back off the 85% truth in sentencing law, and legislators won't take that on for fear of being viewed as soft on crime, even though we could deal with some of the crowding by backing off that a little bit.
One person who was not swayed by that was Billy McCoy. They are sparring, I guess, as it is, and we saw that the House was not ready to give in his flexibility. That was a rationale for that.
Right, right. And like I said earlier, I think it probably plays to the House advantage to have this actually drag on for a little while. And I was going to say, adding to Marty's point, I talked to someone at the Capitol today, not Billy McCoy, but someone else who's a regular up there, who said that, you know, frankly, he was more worried about mental patients being let out of the mental facilities than what he saw as probably people who were just in prison for like selling a little bit of pot or something like that, who these are not going to be the murderers and the rapists probably who would be let out. And so this person was a little bit like, you know, bring it on, Governor. So, I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah.
We have a question from email, and it is from Tom, and it says, what is to be said of the corporate welfare for which the state is paying? Nissan may be up and running, but they are laying off people. Toyota has halted indefinitely any auto production, and the recent $35 million incentive for Schultz may be an investment with no guarantees. There's nothing proven that the income and sales tax generated will ever pay off. The answer: is it just cheap Mississippi labor? When everyone is tightening their belts and the state is requesting K through 12 and university consolidation, why should the state be so free in giving money away, yet they won't fully fund education from year to year? A question from Tom. And Dr. Mary Coleman, I saw you nodding your head.
Well, I've already made the point that we have to put everything on the table. We have to ask, why do we keep giving incentives to businesses to enter the state? At what cost are we giving these incentives? And what difference does it make in the long term in terms of the future development of the state, the human resource development of the state? Cheap labor is only possible because people are underprepared. They're undereducated. And as long as we keep playing the end against the middle, we're going to continue hearing, on the one hand, we need workforce training for people who are not well educated, for perhaps people who left high school at a time when we had industries that required skills that they possess but no longer possess. And so it seems to me that this emailer is asking a really legitimate question that we don't discuss enough in this state.
Corporate welfare, bringing in Nissan and Toyota and Schultz. Corporate welfare, is that a little too strong?
Yeah, I think it's too strong in that a lot of the money was used for workforce training and for infrastructure improvements that were needed in order to get the plant to be there. In other words, not just the plant itself, but the roads, what it needed to have to support this new industry coming into the state. And of course, in all of these cases, if they don't follow through and have the job requirements, there are clawbacks. I mean, they will not continue to they'll have to pay back the incentives. And so I'll tell you, all you've got to do is go up and look in the Columbus area and the Golden Triangle. Look at what's happened in that community as a result of Eurocopter, Severstal, and several others that are there. And I will tell you, it is huge. If you really look at the Madison area and you see what's happened as a result of Nissan, the impact is significant. I've worked in other states where I've seen huge impact from economic development, and that's what we've got to do because, as I mentioned before, we have other states that are doing this. We have to compete. Companies don't look just at the borders. They're looking at multiple areas in a region, and we've got to be able to compete with other states. So I don't see it as corporate welfare. I see it as an investment in the future of this state, and I think our governor and our legislature, both House and Senate, have made wise investments. I pointed out this morning, if we didn't have Chairman Watson in the Ways and Means Committee and Chairman Kirby in Finance, we wouldn't have had these strong economic development partners to be able to help the governor go after these plans.
Okay, and that's something that the governor addressed at the State of the State on Monday, workforce training. Let's hear more from Governor Barber's remarks about workforce training in the state. Here's what he said.
Some think workforce training is something we do for employers to attract industries and jobs, and that's true, but that's only a small part of it. I believe workforce development and skills training are things we owe our working people to help them increase their wages and get better benefits. Sometimes more skills leads to new, higher paying jobs, but most of the time, this training is necessary to keep the current job or to get a promotion at the current workplace, and it works.
We have a call from Sean in Hattiesburg on the line. The phone number once again, 1-877-405-5247. Sean, what's your question for the panel?
I'd like to make a comment. I'd like to talk about a few ways to create new revenue. First, we add a fifth U.S. congressman, since one of our former congressmen said that our U.S. congressmen provide $80 million a year in revenue for Mississippi. We have the population. We need to lobby and get that fifth congressman. Second, let's release all nonviolent prisoners to people who will sponsor them with a place to live. Nonviolent prisoners are eventually going to get out. Release them and expunge their records so that they can get a job. And third, let's stop wasting time fining and penalizing good citizens with fines for nonviolent offenses.
Sean, do you have a question for the panel?
That's what I'd like the panel to go ahead and address those ideas.
Okay. Does anybody see a germ of an idea in the fifth congressman or releasing nonviolent prisoners as a way of saving money in this budget crisis?
We've either got to have more children or bring in more industry if we want a fifth congressman.
Hate we lost them before.
Right. It's a pretty simple equation. If we can just raise our population or annex other states, I guess. I'm just kidding. I'm
old enough to remember when we had 6 congressmen.
Okay. So at least there's some creative ideas out there, and things are on the table right now. The governor did say that, or tried to end his State of the State address on a very positive note on Monday, so let's listen to the close of his speech and what he said.
2010 is the year when we will lead America out of this recession. The year when we'll pick up where we left off before the recession sidetracked our growing economy and rising incomes. We can and will outperform the national economy. We were doing it before this global recession, and we'll be doing it again. So my advice to you as we close is Mississippi. Believe in it.
Okay, Mississippi Believe in It. Was that for a Mississippi audience, or was that for more of a national audience? Did anybody get that feeling?
Well, it was for both.
Really?
Yeah. Both the national and the state audience. I hope it played well with the national audience because it played poorly with me.
Is that right? Why is that? Why you didn't think that that was too optimistic a note to end on?
The governor's speech was disingenuous. I mean, we're not going to lead the nation out of the recession. Our state was one of the last states to feel the recession, so we're not going to be the first to get out. Now, it could be true that the pace at which we get out might be an example to the nation, which would be very nice. And it might be true that if we think seriously about how we diversify the economy, how we diversify the revenue stream, how we build both the skill set and the formal education of our population, if we can do any of those things well, we will lead the nation in unexpected ways, and that will be a great thing for this state and for Haley Barbour.
Okay. Blake?
Well, I think it's important to note that Mississippi still is a rather slow growth state. We're not a boom state, but these structural economic development successes that we've had in recent years put us in a place to move forward better than some other states that are slow growth states. I mean, it's not just the Deep South. If you look at Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, there are other states with some of the same challenges we face. My home state of Delaware just lost 2 automobile plants. Devastating. They would love to have a Toyota plant sitting there ready to open instead of a closed Chrysler and GM plant.
Okay. Dr. Weissman?
Well, everything to me right now goes back to education. And we've had so much lately discussion that we've moved from brawn to brains as far as the ability to create income. And I'm almost tortured to think that we're going to cut education by as much as is on the table. I don't think you can have workforce development. I don't think you can be attractive to the kind of industry that we've been attractive to in the past without education. And we've got the early childhood education thing to address that we have avoided doing, where that gap is created in our ability to educate people so they can step up to that pay window when they're 18, 19, 20 or go on to colleges. And I don't think we can waste a year on backing up on education, and that's the biggest concern I have.
Emily, did you think that the governor's, the way he ended the speech, or any parts of the speech, was more for a national audience to raise his profile? He's been talked about very seriously as a candidate for national office when he leaves Mississippi's governor's office.
I agree with Dr. Coleman that I think it was intended for both a state audience and a national audience. And I don't think you'll find anybody, probably even the governor, who would say that this was anywhere close to being one of his better speeches. A lawmaker told me immediately afterward, look, I've heard better, I've heard worse. It was just kind of there. There was very little, there was really no soaring rhetoric in that speech. At the very end, it really was the closest he came to being sort of inspirational in any way. And we could all probably sit around and debate the sincerity of that, but you know, maybe there is a legitimate role for a leader of a state to have that almost cheerleading kind of role in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah, to try to uplift the audience somehow.
Okay, so it didn't hurt him on the national stage any, but you don't think it was specifically designed for that. We have an email question we want to get to before we close out here. There's a lot of money lost in this state. This is from Mark, by the way. There's a lot of money lost in the state from 16th section land leases. The lease rates are not adjusted properly, and the school districts do not get what they should for lease rates. This is because, in Mark's opinion here, because it is a political hot potato that nobody wants to touch, from local school districts to the Secretary of State's office. It may be time to touch on this issue. Mary?
I don't know. I suspect it is time to touch on the issue. I remember growing up in a community that was inundated with 16th section land. It was very cheap, is what I remember. Many people were afforded an opportunity to have homes because it was so cheap. So I think everything has to be on the table. Every source of revenue has to be on the table.
And I think this email writer is going to be very pleased to know the Secretary of State, Delbert Hosemann, has taken this on and has made this one of his key priorities, is to deal with bringing equity to the 16th section land. This makes a whole lot of sense.
With what consequences? so far? Any consequences?
Well, I mean, he hasn't had to face re-election, but
well,
you know.
Here's one interesting thing that Delbert Hosemann has done as Secretary of State is he has put 16th section records on websites and made it very easily accessible to the public, so you can go on there and see if your neighbor down the road is getting a dirt cheap lease where you're paying something that's much more substantial, and so that allows, I think, not only a more educated public, but it gives people a chance to evaluate the situation and to maybe put pressure on the local school board to be more serious about getting good leases.
So the more transparency, the better in that case.
Always.
It's a very, very strong leadership role on his part to step forward and say, we've got to make sure we're bringing equity here. And that was a very courageous move on his part.
Okay, well, all in all, I mean, the legislative session is just starting. It's maybe a little too early to handicap what do you think is going to be the most important issue. But does anybody very quickly have any quick issues that they're going to see that's going to dominate this legislature other than the budget cuts?
Just fixing the budget woes.
Budgets.
It's all about the
There's
budget.
nothing but it's all about the budget.
And putting Mississippi in the place of greatest opportunity, making sure that we're still positioned to be in a competitive position once this recession ends. It will end.
Okay. Well, that is all the time that we have for tonight's program. I'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Mary Coleman and Blake Wilson, Dr. Marty Weissman, and Emily Wagster Pettis. We also want to thank you for joining our discussion tonight. We've enjoyed it, and we invite you to tune in next week at 7 o'clock for Quorum. Also, tonight's program will be available for viewing on our website beginning tomorrow. That address is mpbonline.org. I'm Ron Brown. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.